Anyone who follows the news knows that China and the United States are equal heavyweights in the world economy. Someone thinks that Beijing has already overtaken Washington. Someone says that the coronavirus has rolled back the economy of the Middle Kingdom, and America will be in the lead for a long time. In any case, if these people 60 years ago were told that impoverished post-war China would become one of the two key giants of the world, they would just twist their fingers at the temple. How did China become the leader in almost all industries? Who moved it to the top, and who will remain the leader in the future? In this issue, the most important and interesting things about the confrontation between China and America: not every eye sees the enemy. This proverb very aptly describes the history of the emergence of China as we know it now. Money is the main element of influence in the modern world. Since the 44th year, the world's financial power was concentrated in the United States. During the reconstruction of post-war Western Europe, the United States used its position as a creditor to influence the trading blocs of Great Britain and France. Loans for reconstruction were given in exchange for imports of American goods and giving Washington veto power in international organizations. This system was supported by fixed exchange rates in gold, but increased spending on the military-industrial complex, especially at the height of the Cold War, and a shrinking trade balance led to budget deficits in the US. The deficit was largely due to military spending abroad, but the Americans did not want to come out of the Cold War as losers. As American allies exchanged their dollars for gold, the convertibility of the dollar became unstable. The volume of dollars in circulation exceeded the established norm of the gold reserve, which led to a difficult situation. In '71, the Nixon administration decided to detach the dollar from gold and devalued it by 10%. It was a clever geopolitical move. Now, foreign central banks could no longer exchange dollars for gold, thus losing control over the US economy. At the same time, they could not give up the dollar because it could lead to a shortage of their dollar reserves. As a result, they were forced to invest dollars in US Treasury bonds at interest, so they essentially recognized the supremacy of the dollar. It now became the world currency independent of the gold standard, which gave Washington financial freedom for military needs abroad. The dollar sent abroad was returned back through foreign central banks in the form of treasury notes, which created an endless cycle and acted as a perpetual motion machine in the economy. It was possible to financially support any military plans. Why not place military bases around the world if the spent funds were returned with payments for defense services? Throughout this time, fears of a possible international monetary crisis have prevented other countries from simply exposing and abandoning the US strategy. As a result, the United States' status as a major debtor has strengthened its influence rather than weakened it. The ability to earn dollars in this cunning way freed them from the strict rules of economic discipline that they had created through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to other countries with dollar debts. The 74th year deal with Saudi Arabia further strengthened their position. Arabs sold oil for dollars and invested the proceeds in US Treasury bonds. Combined with America's dominance in agriculture, this meant that unilateral dollar sanctions could deprive many countries, especially those dependent on trade with the States, of the opportunity to import food and energy resources. Of course, not everyone liked this smooth scheme, but no one could make any serious steps. The Americans themselves dug the hole for themselves. It was US companies that poured huge amounts of money and investment into fast-growing China. It was the US that became the godfather of the Chinese economic miracle after the Soviet-Chinese armed conflict on the Damansk Peninsula. In '69, Washington mistakenly thought that a new ally had emerged in the fight against the Soviets. In '70, a multi-billion-dollar concept of China's opening was already ready, developed by Henry Kissinger, the US president's national security advisor. Beijing's economic development interests were then lobbied by President Jimmy Carter. In China, the guide to attracting foreign direct investment was Deng Xiaoping, who blessed the financial flow with the famous phrase, "No matter what color the cat is, black or white, a good cat is the one that catches mice." China announced a new foreign policy of foreign openness, the purpose of which was to attract foreign direct investment. And this meant unusual investments, but the creation from scratch of high-tech joint ventures, joint projects for the exploration and development of natural resources, compensation deals that provided for the direct provision of equipment, technology, technical and expert personnel by foreign companies, in general, and money and people and technology. The American economy continued to strengthen despite emerging crises, largely due to skillful policies and strategic alliances. Sometimes the scale and methods of assistance to China led not only to benefits, but also to strategic losses for the US. Here is a vivid example. In California, there was a plant of rare earth metals, which the Americans considered harmful to their ecology. They decided to dismantle it to give it to China, and there, on a huge deposit of Bayan, they both built a new plant, Baogan. It employs about 20,000 people, and in 12 years, China has increased its production of these metals fivefold, taking control of 93% of the world market. This has allowed China to manipulate prices, which has become a big problem for the US and other countries. At first, thanks to cheap labor and resources, China lowered prices by taking competitors out of the game. And then in 2010, it cut exports, which sharply raised prices for components for high-tech goods, sometimes by hundreds or even thousands of %. Now, rare earth metals are brought for processing to Baogan from all over the world, and it is not just a huge profit, but a powerful geopolitical tool. Beijing can actually stop the production of high-tech and even military products all over the world. China has taken full advantage of the favorable political and economic atmosphere of the 80s. First of all, it became a global consumer goods factory. Then, having picked up financial and production forces, it identified the most promising areas of industrial production and rushed into microelectronics, machine tool construction, aviation, and astronautics. All in all, first catching mice with an American cat, that is since the 80s, almost 400,000 new enterprises were built in China from scratch. If in the same 80s, in current prices, the industry produced products worth $134 billion. In 2019, it will be worth $4 trillion of the same dollars. In the world, the share of Chinese industry has grown from 3 to 25%. As a result of financial injections, carrot and stick policies in the hands of the Communist Party, and of course the hard work of the Chinese themselves. The growth of the celestial economy has stunned the whole world, 79th to 2010 by 10%, from 2001 to 2019 9.2%. The volume of GDP from 78th to 2019 increased 269 times. In 2019, the gross regional product in only one of the most developed provinces of Guangdong exceeded the GDP of the whole of Russia. In 2020, all China GDP crossed the mystical bar of 100 trillion yuan. As of 2020, US-China trade volume totaled $588 billion. China's share of US trade is 12.6% of the PRC's foreign trade volume. China is the largest trading partner of the US. For the US, China is the largest export market and the third largest trading partner after the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the European Union. The US trade deficit with China already exceeds $330 billion. The US believes that China deliberately undervalues the yuan against the dollar for the expansion of its goods in the foreign market. If after China's accession to the WTO in 2001, the yuan's exchange rate against the dollar was growing, then in recent years the reverse process is taking place. These two factors, the devaluation of the yuan and the growing deficit of US foreign trade with China, have led to a trade war between the two countries, which has already turned into a political war. Having gained economic power, China began to invest in everything around it, then expanded its influence on all continents. To understand the scale of China's huge economy, one can look at the impressive size of the economy of the country's cities. Have you ever heard of such cities as Shijiazhuang, Wuxi, Changsha, Suzhou, Ningbo, Foshan, or Yantai? Meanwhile, millions of people live there, and the GDP of the cities is comparable to the GDP of entire countries. For example, the city of Shenzhen has a GDP and purchasing power parity of $491 billion, close to the GDP of Sweden. And if we take into account that these cities do not exist in isolation, but together make up entire mega-regions, the figures are even more striking. Thus, in the Yangtze River Delta region, there are Shanghai, Suzhou, Nanjing. In total, their GDP is 2.62 trillion dollars, which is comparable to the Italian economy. The cities of Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Foshan, and others form the Zhujiang Pearl River Delta. The total GDP there is equal to 1.89 trillion dollars. That is more than the GDP of South Korea. In 2023, China will rank first in the number of scientific developments in many key technology areas. A study by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute shows that China leads in 37 of the 44 areas studied. From nanomaterials and robotics to advanced radio frequency communications, defense and space technologies. In particular, in the past 5 years, Chinese scientists have created 49% of the most important scientific papers on advanced aviation technologies, including hypersonic rocket engines. The country is home to 7 out of 10 scientific centers that are leaders in this field. The second place in the technology race is held by the United States, which holds leadership in 8 areas, including quantum computing and vaccine development. The other countries lag behind with a significant gap. The top 5 in terms of the number of advanced scientific publications are most often India and the United Kingdom, less commonly South Korea, Germany, Australia, Italy. At the end of the 23rd, China surpassed Japan in car exports. China received the main increase due to increased demand for cars with gasoline engines, since Russia is facing sanctions from European, Japanese, and Korean automakers. In 23, the Chinese currency ranked second among the most popular currencies in trade settlements through the SWIFT International Financial Messaging System, displacing the euro in third place. The US dollar ranked first, followed by the Japanese yen, the Saudi rial, the Indonesian rupiah, the Thai baht dirham UAE, the Vietnamese dong, and the British pound sterling. Russia has switched to yuan settlements with China, and already more than 2/3 of all trade transactions are conducted in national currencies, and this figure is likely to increase. For example, the largest company, Asia Import Group, pays for cargoes transported from China to Russia in yuan in 95% of cases, and in the remaining 5% in dollars. Latin America is also gradually abandoning settlements with China in dollars and switching to Chinese currency. Brazil has signed an agreement with China on the use of cashless payment in yuan. This greatly simplifies bilateral trade between the countries. Brazil's example was followed by Argentina, which said it would start paying for Chinese imports in Chinese currency units instead of US dollars. This will preserve the dollar reserves of the Argentine Central Bank, which are needed to pay off debt and finance imports. Bolivia plans to join these countries. Its president, Luis Arce, announced his readiness to use the yuan in international trade. He added that this could become a trend throughout Latin America. And now we are smoothly transported to the underbelly of America. In 2000, US President George W. Bush said, "Those who ignore Latin America do not fully understand America itself, and those who ignore our hemisphere do not fully understand American interests." Our state, for example, was rightly concerned about Kosovo, but Colombia has more refugees. America was very right to be concerned about Kuwait, but we get much more oil in Venezuela. America is right to welcome trade with China, but we export almost as much to Brazil. Bush would probably be surprised to learn that 24 years later, his speech was taken more seriously in Beijing than in Washington, D.C. This is what the Uyuni salt flats look like, home to the world's largest concentration of lithium ores, part of the so-called lithium triangle between Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. This region contains about 70% of the world's lithium reserves. At present, the situation seems stable. However, lithium sources in this region will soon be exhausted. Lithium is a key material for the development of renewable energy technologies. Therefore, in a few decades, these salt flats could be catastrophically depleted. The largest investors in the lithium triangle are Chinese companies that hold significant stakes in this region. But the lithium triangle is just a representative example. China is actively expanding its presence in the region, investing not only financially, but also participating in construction projects and space programs. Having opened up Asia and Africa, Beijing is gradually opening up South America with its economic can opener. Over the past 2 decades, China's trade with Latin America has grown 26-fold, and by 2035, the trade volume is expected to reach $700 billion. This dynamic clearly demonstrates the loss of the United States' influence in the region, which for a long time was considered its most unquestioned influencer. Everyone knows how brutal the regimes and individuals in South America can be, like drug lord Escobar in Colombia, who blew up airplanes for power, or Pinochet, who gave firing orders in Chile. But despite the criminality of drug trafficking and other problems, South America remains a good place for business. The continent is known for developed agriculture, livestock, forestry, fishing, non-ferrous minerals, hydrocarbons, and hydropower. Much of the local infrastructure is based on exports, leaving domestic markets in decline. The region's domestic economy suffers from underdeveloped infrastructure and a shortage of skilled labor. For China, South America is a unique place for another reason. It is a region with a rich history of authoritarianism, much like China itself. When Beijing makes deals, it prefers long-term contracts, especially with state-owned enterprises, considering them more reliable investments. In addition, most South American governments are presidential systems where the president is the head of the executive branch. This means that Chinese politicians do not have to go through multiple layers of bureaucracy. Instead, they can negotiate directly with the head of state. We have already seen from the African experience that China does not care whether a country with Beijing's economic interests is authoritarian or democratic. It just wants to do business, and business is going well. Today, China is South America's largest trading partner. For Chile, trade with China accounts for 34% of its total merchandise turnover. Brazil and Peru 28% each, Uruguay 20%, Ecuador 19%, Colombia and Paraguay 18% each, and Bolivia and Argentina 14% each. But China's main trading partner has become Venezuela. The local government has taken out 17 loans totaling $62 billion. The lion's share of Chinese investment has been invested in oil exploration and production. But according to economists, the amount of loans is already so unsustainable that Venezuela has lost its economic sovereignty. In 2008, China used its influence in Venezuela to join the Inter-American Development Bank, and a year later, the Caribbean Development Bank, becoming a voting member. These banks include the entire Latin American and Caribbean region. The banks can finance projects of any complexity in the region, and more importantly, can lend to state-owned corporations. Since 2008, China's tentacles have been reaching out to the region's economy. The Chinese have provided loans to Ecuador totaling more than $18 billion for various infrastructures, including the construction of the Coca-Codo-Sinclair hydroelectric dam. The power plant doesn't look all that impressive, unlike the numbers that China had to pay. The Bank of China loan for the dam is $1.7 billion at a rate of 7% for a term of 15 years, which is $125 million per year in interest only. Ecuador pays off its debt to China by providing China with oil at a discount, and China currently imports 80% of the oil produced in Ecuador. By the way, Xi Jinping himself opened the hydropower plant 7 years ago, and last year, the Ecuadorian media wrote that the dam was covered with thousands of cracks. In Bolivia, state companies signed an agreement with a Chinese corporation on the exploration and mining of lithium deposits worth more than $1 billion, and this industry promises to grow tenfold in the coming years. In Chile, China has invested $13 billion in the same way it has in Africa, by acquiring shares in local power grids, medical facilities, roads, and railroads. In Brazil, authorities have taken out more than a dozen loans totaling $30 billion, mostly for projects in power generation and oil and gas operations. In recent years, China has shifted its focus to logistics and technology. For example, in 2017, Chinese conglomerate CNPs acquired 90% of the port of Paranagua, the largest commercial port in Brazil. And in 21 years, the Chinese shared what modern Chinese cities cannot be imagined without: Huawei and Hikvision shared surveillance cameras with facial recognition technology with the most populous city in Brazil, São Paulo. This huge city ranks 4th on the list of the largest cities in the world. What the introduction of such cameras means beyond security does not even need to be explained. Argentina has 13 outstanding loans worth $17 billion. Chinese companies are actively involved in various local industries, especially in construction, mining, and agriculture. However, the current $17 billion is at risk of doubling because Argentina faced another financial crisis in 22, of which the country seems to have had more than the rest of the world. And this time, Argentina was lucky enough to sign an investment agreement with China worth almost $24 billion. Thus, by controlling financial flows throughout South America, China has reached into the so-called underbelly of the United States. But it's not just about finances. Beijing is also actively working to strengthen its military influence. In Peru, near the capital Lima, a Peruvian military company is building a deep-sea port in the city of Chancay. This port can be quickly converted from civilian to military purposes. The project, costing $1.3 billion, will create a direct route to China. Usually, ships from South America to the Middle Kingdom take more than 45 days. The new project will reduce travel time for ships by 10 days. In the south of Argentina is the Espacio Lejano Station, which is part of China's long-distance space communications network for interplanetary missions and spacecraft. This base allows China to perform aerospace monitoring and intercept signals over long distances. Similar situation in Venezuela. There is a space base, El Sombrero, from which China launches satellites into orbit on trajectories inaccessible to its own territory. And in 2005, China deployed several ground control stations, tracking thousands of satellites and objects in Earth's orbit. In total, there are 11 ground control stations belonging to China located in South America. Their specific purpose and capabilities are unknown. However, it is assumed that they can be used for both scientific and military purposes. In recent years, the world has been changing so rapidly that it is difficult to predict whether there will be a direct military conflict between the United States and China, or whether the Chinese yuan will go the way of the dollar. What do you think about the future leaders of the world? Write in the comments.